We're going to move on, Shawn, now to a question that came in on Twitter from Parker. He mentions he's digging into all the tools up on the RotoViz website, the best ball tools specifically. So he doesn't recall much conversation around this on any of the podcasts. So the specific scenario that he has mentioned is what to do in spots of the draft where taking the best player available, pair the rankings on the website, or pair his own personal rankings, or pair your rankings, would be a reach by ADP. He mentions the example that came for him in the Best Ball Mania tree over at Underdog.com. Waddle being the best player available, then DJ Moore and Deontay Johnson. Josh Allen's also in there as well. And then he's asking, would we take Jalen Waddle? So if we look at the players that were available on the board at the time by ADP, though, it is Nick Chubb, Mike Williams, Josh Allen, Michael Pittman, James Conner, Jalen Waddle, Cortland Sutton, DJ Moore, Ezekiel Elliott, Travis Etienne, Deontay Johnson, Darren Waller. So what he's saying really is there's a lot of players there by ADP, but based on your rankings, then the best player available would likely be Jalen Waddle, who is in the mid-range of that ADP. So then when are we taking that player ahead of one of those other players in front, and that's classed as a reach? When is it not a reach, I guess? And then, at what point should we not be doing that? I think anything within, for me, I'll let you give the proper answer, but within half a round to 9 picks, I think could be seen as a reach. But if it's a player of the right profile that you want to draft, I think those reaches are fine, in my opinion. I've been reaching a little bit, if we want to call it that, on Rashad Bateman, for example, this year. But there is certain areas where the draft becomes a little bit flatter, and I think that's more where the reaches happen. In this specific scenario, Shawn, what would your thoughts on how to decide whether to reach or whether to take I guess we'll say the quote-unquote safe player at ADP, for example, in this case, Nick Chubb?
There's so much that goes into this, and it is a fun element as we kind of develop through time with the way that you want to draft. And there are a variety of ways to do it. I don't think that any of the ways, at least that I prefer, are necessarily wrong, but you want to think through how you want your teams built. And so we know that the structure element is going to come into play. I very strongly believe that you need to combine structure with player selection to give yourself the best chance and really create these individual seasons where you just have incredible results. It's not going to happen every season. And I think I mentioned on the show before that in the last, say, 15 years, there are about 4 years where I feel like my rankings perform pretty poorly. And 2022 could be that year. And so one of the things that, if you're worried about that element of it, then you want to be even more cognizant of getting values. But getting values is always going to be an important part of what we do. And one way I think that might be helpful to think about this is to divide the players on your board into buckets of players that you want to have a very high exposure to, players that you're willing to draft and you think that could be good pieces to have some exposure to when you get a value on them. And then the players where, more or less you don't think that they fit your drafting profile and they don't have very strong likelihoods of outperforming ADP. So we talk about the big win, small loss types of players. That's more or less the profile that we're going after. ADP is getting sharper in terms of identifying those players and kind of moving them into a range where, then sometimes you look at them and say, well, these guys are actually a little bit above what the projections say. But drafters understand that from a scenario-based perspective, there are a lot of different ways that they could crush, and it's going to be difficult to reflect all of that in projections because you have teammates. We don't know what teammate injuries are going to happen. We do know that injuries will happen. And one of the things that you will see is that running back injuries play a very dynamic role in the course of the season. That's one of the reasons why zero RB works. But teammate injuries will play a role also at wide receiver, not necessarily moving backup wide receivers into a starting role and dominating for you there, but it can influence the ultimate upside for the other starting wide receivers who are sort of already being looked at in your lineup. So there are a lot of different elements that go into that. But one of the pieces that I do right before the season, and I'll probably need to put out some closer to the middle of the summer this year as well, sort of an early look at it, but priority picks, other targets, players that I'm not drafting. Occasionally the players I'm not drafting will hit too, so that will happen. But when we're looking at these players who are most likely to destroy ADP, those will be the priorities. The players who are good players and probably are going to help your roster when you get a value on them, the second bucket, and then the guys that we tend to ignore would be the third bucket. You're not going to be drafting those, but by introducing some of those other players as possible draft picks below ADP, you're able to create some diversification within your portfolio, and you're able to do it at a good price because you're not drafting those players, the kind of middle group, unless they're a really good value. So you get those guys, the ones you're a little bit more skeptical about, at great prices. You get your own players, maybe with mild reaches we want to have exposure to. But one of the things that can be very helpful, and this is something that Colm and I do when we draft together, it's something I've done when I draft with Curtis or draft with Blair, is you put together your board not based on your rankings, but based on ADP and how you expect each individual round to play out. And then within that round, you figure out who your targets are going to be, and you can deal with the scenarios that come up within the course of a draft, right? That also helps prepare you for that draft, and you don't get hit when you're on the clock and say, who am I going to pick now? You have all of that worked out. And if your targets in that round somehow are all gone at your pick, you can move to the next round. And that's maybe where you would take somebody who's a little bit more of a reach. So to break it down a little bit more, Colm, one of the good things about playing a lot of teams, and one of the things that was in this question is the first year for this drafter to play a lot of best ball, is that playing a lot of leagues then frees you up and you don't feel that pressure to reach for your guy. If you're playing, one or two leagues, especially if you're playing a redraft league with, your college friends or something to that effect, your work buddies, then, you may be like, I'm just going to go out and draft my guys and not worry about it. And number one, that's absolutely fine. Number two, because you aren't playing 10 leagues, you're not like daring your priority targets to fall. One of the things that you can do when you're playing a bunch of leagues is you can let those guys fall and you can say, look, I'm going to get them at values as well as getting a high percentage of them. We don't want to get into a dynamic where the blinkers are on to such an extent that we feel like we have to have it. And this is one of the things that will come into play with rankings too, is if you look at my rankings, there are going to be a small handful of players that are so far above ADP that the instinct is perhaps to get them in every league. I would encourage people not to do that. I try to put the rankings out there from the perspective of where I do really see the players as being values. I think that can help users to realize that maybe ADP isn't right, that maybe some of these players are not being thought about correctly in the wider fantasy community. But even beyond that, it's helpful to see what an individual ranker actually thinks, as opposed to just seeing kind of where they maybe have made some mild tweaks and are essentially going with ADP. Because if you see what I think, and you have your other 5, 6, 7 favorite analysts, what they think and what they really think, then you can use that information. Whereas if it's sort of watered down, then it's less informational to you, even when they're wrong. When you're actually getting the right rankings, you're getting information that you wouldn't otherwise get. So then you want to take that and you want to put it in the context of, okay, how do I need to draft on it? And that's sort of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, that all makes great sense, Shawn, in terms of it. And there is times, like the thing you hit on there is if you're drafting in, 4 leagues, like if you draft that player twice, you have a 50% exposure at that point. If you're drafting in 50 leagues and you draft them, you have to draft them 25 times to have that same effect. So it all does balance out. And there will be times where we can't believe our luck when we get a player 8 picks after ADP, and there'll be other times where we have to take him 6 picks before ADP. It'll just depend. But something that Shawn mentioned there that I really like doing, and people will know from listening to the content that we're putting out in the drafts that we do, there is certain players in certain rounds that we probably don't talk very much about, or we don't like, they're just not really on our list. And one of my favorite things each year is Shawn's list that he mentioned there with the priorities, the targets, and the kind of avoids, and that there is a good process to have. It can be tricky if you're like, let's say last year we weren't prioritizing Cooper Kupp. That can be a little bit hurtful as the season goes on. But if you are prioritizing Deebo Samuel, that can be a huge amount of joy as the season goes on. So yeah, all different processes to helping you with your drafts. Another part, Shawn, of this question, the second part was related to that can result in him getting a lot of players at the same spot. So Kenneth Walker, Garrett Wilson, and Devin Singletary are mentioned, and I'm in that same boat where I'm getting a lot of Devin Singletary. But at what point should he worry about being overweight on players? So is it 50% rostered? Is it higher than that? Is it lower than that? And as you mentioned earlier, he does say it's his first year playing a bunch of best ball. So another topic on that, I talked with Michael Dubner probably about a month ago to 6 weeks ago. We talked about when to draft, and we also talked in that episode on the RotoViz Best Ball podcast feed and on the RotoViz YouTube channel about how to manage your bankroll. So if it is your first year playing, it is very important to manage bankroll, because we are now in June, at the end of June, but we have a long way to go before the season starts. So managing your bankroll is very important. But I also touched on there, Shawn, the volume of leagues. If it is 2 leagues, if it is 20 leagues, if it is, some people are drafting in multiple thousand leagues this year. If you're max entering some of these tournaments at 150 entries at a time, that can add up very quickly. So the percentage is going to vary dramatically based on how many you're playing in. But I guess we'll say for this example, maybe we'll go with 20 leagues, because that means that you can draft a player multiple times and not just have 50% of them on your roster. What is the point where you become concerned about how much you have drafted of a player? And my one, I don't know if I'll ever get to the point again where I was at with James Conner last year, because I was starting to get worried, but we were in the 40% range heading into week 1 when that happened.
I try not to look at it from the perspective of a specific percentage, but more from trying to make sure that I'm getting value on those guys. And as we get deeper into draft season and there's someone who is extremely highly rostered, then I'm going to move a little bit in the direction of needing a better value on them all the way through. So a player that I was hitting a lot, 3 or 4 spots above ADP in the early going, and end up getting just a huge exposure. Then in the second half, maybe you're looking to get those players 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spots below ADP. I think the bankroll mention is a good one. We don't want anybody to get so excited about the potential of these contests and the fun of these contests. And one of the things I encourage people to think about is not so much the return, but the fun. I mean, if you're playing fantasy football to make money, I mean, that's going to be something that works for a handful of people who are spending, all of their time on it. But so much of the value to you as a listener, as a player, is that it's so much fun. So we're going to be thinking about it from a fun perspective. We're going to be thinking about it from a perspective of not spending more money than you have. I've been fortunate enough to cash in a pretty big way on a number of circumstances. And I'm not necessarily looking to plow all of that money back in part because for me personally, I want to be heavy on the players that I like. Many listeners will know one of the very lucky things that happened to me was finishing first and second in the NFFC primetime contest in 2013. If I'm not drafting some similar rosters, that's not going to happen. Right? You're not going to have the players to finish both first and second unless there's a lot of overlap. And so I like to go with the players that I think give the best chance to win, even if I end up being high on them. And I know that in certain years, like I mentioned, I think there have been 4 years that I did poorly. I want to be able to withstand those years as opposed to be so diversified in all years that my upside has also been diversified away. That also means you have to be cognizant of what you're spending in the years that maybe you lose out, because you don't want to lose all your money when you hit one of these rougher years. Then I think we can get into the nuance a little bit, where there are some ways that you can play it where I think the diversification matters. I think you want a little bit more diversification early. This question obviously related to Jalen Waddle. There are some interesting names on the board in this example that is presented in terms of Nick Chubb, Mike Williams. Mike Williams, someone who's probably being overdrafted. And yet, within the context of this Los Angeles Chargers offense, you can see the upside there. So if you can get him below ADP, even if you think he's overvalued, the fact that you got a better value on him than most drafters got, you'll probably want to take that and then build around him in a way that makes sense. And then you have exposure if he does hit. And so you could play it that way. We don't have Michael Pittman very high relative to consensus, but if Matt Ryan has sort of this resurgence. If he becomes sort of the Kurt Warner, then maybe you take him when he slides 4 or 5 spots below where he's going, because then when you did have him, you had him below what most drafters were playing. I also think that you want to have more diversification early, because there's less chance for a player to absolutely destroy ADP in the opening rounds because the expectations are already so high, right? So, we're looking at we talked about having Waddle and not having higher than Tyreek Hill straight up, but having him priced in a way or ranked in a way where we would end up with Waddle. We wouldn't necessarily end up with Hill, but if Hill falls below ADP, then you take him. Make sure you get a little bit of that exposure. The players that we're looking to get early will depend a little bit about how sort of legendary, to use the term that Patrick Crane has coined for running backs. You can look at that, I think, also for the wide receivers. Really trying to get the superstars at the positions as opposed to players who have a first month workload that kind of puts their projection up in this range. So that's what I would be doing there as I diversify. But you probably don't want to have all the same guys in the first 1, 2, 3 rounds. It's just so hard for them to absolutely dominate. Now, again, you're going to be on some players and not on others. For example, Jonathan Taylor was someone that we were very high on last year, because especially once he starts to fall into that 202, 203 range, the chance for him to finish is basically the 101, which is what we have been talking about through most of the summer and into July, August, was very high. And there is a big advantage to be gained from, number one, there's always a big advantage to be gained from drafting the best player. But if you draft the best player in the early second round, you still do dramatically outperform. So we are going after our players, but make sure that you're moving that around a little early. Another place where I'm okay being very heavy on a guy is if I think they're going to get more expensive. Now, sometimes you're wrong about this. There's a little bit of hubris in saying, oh, the market is wrong on these players right now. They're going to definitely get more expensive. But one of the reasons that I was drafting a lot of hyper fragile early in Underdog was that there were running backs there that it was almost impossible for them not to get more expensive, right? Saquon Barkley was one. We've now seen him move. Breece Hall is another. We haven't really seen that move yet. I think that we will, as reports are going to continue to trickle out that he's the best player on the Jets. Travis Etienne was one, and he's taken a huge jump just in the last couple of weeks, which is unfortunate, but hopefully you had a lot of exposure to him early when the price was kind of silly. And then J.K. Dobbins is another one that I expect to go. Now, he's going to go in the other direction still for a while. And there's if you're right on 4 or 5 of these and then wrong on 1 or 2, you come out ahead. There's a chance that Dobbins sinks and sinks and sinks. At the same time, he goes out in not necessarily the preseason. I don't know if he's going to play at all, if the Baltimore running backs are going to play early on. But you have some of these practices where no one can touch him and he's through the hole and, to daylight. And those reports come out. I mean, is he not going to jump into the 3rd round? So he's one where there's a lot of range, but also on that list. And then Trey Lance, I want to stop mentioning that because I don't want him to jump, but I do think that he will. So if you have players where you feel like you have to get the exposure now because you're not going to be able to get the exposure later. I mean, Javonte Williams was one such player last year where we're getting exposure early and then not so much late because, once a player who's sharing time with Melvin Gordon gets into round 4, it's going to be difficult to beat that. It's not impossible. If Melvin Gordon had gotten hurt, then Javonte Williams perhaps is the ultimate league winner in all of 2021. But you want to kind of think through it from that perspective. And then finally, Colm, one of the things here, and Blair Andrews has the Win the Flex tool up for 2022. It's one of the favorite tools that I have. It gives you just so much kind of environmental awareness on how these leagues play out in any given year. But the other reason that I was drafting a lot of hyperfragile on Underdog is that these are very different formats. So one of the things that you see with the Underdog is that because you have 2 running backs and 3 wide receivers guaranteed, and then the 1 flex, that you have to build a team that will work with 3 wide receivers. So it has to be wide receiver heavy enough to match that. But we also know that the FFPC is basically a 2 running back, 4 wide receiver format. If you're drafting running backs to get into the flex, you're almost certainly going to lose. Now, that doesn't have to happen every year. We've talked about the fact that we're going to have another 2016 at some point. And 2016 was a year where the running back heavy drafters dominated. I mean, they won all the leagues, they won all the money, and it played out very nicely. That's going to happen again. If it happens in 2022, then some of these thoughts on, it's a 2 running back, 4 wide receiver format, will look bad specifically for that season. But big picture, we know it's 2 running back, 4 wide receiver. It's not really being drafted that way. And part of the reason it's 2 running back, 4 wide receivers is because it's full PPR, and Underdog is not. You look at the numbers here, and you're getting very good values related to format. If you select wide receivers early in FFPC, you're getting a very good value related to format. If you select running backs early in Underdog, I think that you have to play these formats off of each other. And I think you can even play it off of Dynasty, where in some of the Dynasty formats, we're seeing really weird prices on players relative to where they're going in Best Ball. Select the player who fits the best for the format and is the best value in that format. We've got a lot of tools up at RotoViz and a lot of content up at RotoViz to help you determine what those plays are. I would feel good having heavy exposure to the players who are the right value in their format.